The rain was relentless. Thomas stood by the small cracked mirror in his room, adjusting the collar of his second-hand suit, the best he had. The dim light flickered above him, and outside, the sky was a heavy shade of grey, mirroring the storm inside his chest. Today was the day, the chance he had worked his entire life for. He took a deep breath, ignoring the hunger clawing at his stomach. There was no time for breakfast, no time for anything but getting to Reynolds Enterprises. His mother had already left for work, and his younger brother was still asleep in the tiny bedroom they shared. He didn't wake him. No point in making promises until he had something real to offer. Grabbing his battered leather bag, he stepped out onto the street and immediately regretted it. His old boots, already worn beyond saving, soaked through the moment they hit the pavement. The rain poured down in thick sheets, turning the sidewalks into miniature rivers. He checked his watch. 9:45 a.m. 15 minutes. His interview was across the city, in one of the tallest buildings downtown. If he hurried, he could still catch a bus, or maybe, if luck was on his side, a cheap taxi. Thomas pulled his coat tighter around himself and moved quickly, weaving between pedestrians. The city was awake, people rushing in every direction, some shielded under umbrellas, others like him, completely at the mercy of the storm. As he reached the corner, he saw a bus approaching and sprinted toward the stop. Hope surged in his chest. If he caught it now, he could make it. Then life intervened. A piercing scream cut through the rain. Thomas froze. A child's cry. His head snapped to the side, searching. And then he saw her. A little girl, no older than 6, was gripping the edge of an overflowing storm drain. Her small hands barely holding on against the powerful current, trying to drag her in. Her tiny fingers were slipping. Time slowed. Thomas looked at his watch. 9:47 a.m. If he ran now, he could still... Another scream. The girl's head dipped lower, the water rising around her fragile frame. Thomas didn't think. He moved. His feet splashed through the flooded street as he dropped his bag and threw himself to the ground beside her. "Hold on," he shouted, reaching for her wrists. Her eyes were wide with terror, her body trembling. I can't." The rain was deafening. The water was pulling her with terrifying force. Thomas dug his heels into the ground and gripped her arms just as her fingers slipped. For a split second, he thought he had lost her. But no, he had her. His muscles burned as he pulled with everything he had, his suit soaking through, his heart hammering against his ribs. The girl screamed. The current fought back, and then, with one last surge of strength, he pulled her free. The force sent them both crashing onto the sidewalk, Thomas's back slamming against the wet pavement. The little girl clung to him, sobbing. "You're safe," he panted, holding her close for just a moment before looking around. Where was her mother? Then, as if summoned by his thoughts, a woman appeared, running toward them, her face twisted with terror. "Lee!" she cried. The girl whimpered and tore away from Thomas, rushing into her mother's arms. The woman collapsed to her knees, clutching her daughter tightly, pressing frantic kisses into her wet hair. Thomas sat there, breathless, watching. Then the woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with emotion. You saved her." Thomas nodded numbly, exhaustion crashing over him like a second wave. The woman fumbled through her bag with shaking hands and pulled out a small, elegant business card. "If you ever need anything," she whispered, pressing it into his palm. "Anything at all." Thomas barely registered it. He was still trying to catch his breath. Then his gaze dropped to his wrist. His watch. 9:58 a.m. His stomach dropped. The realization hit him like a freight train. He was too late. The interview, his one shot at changing everything, was gone. He closed his eyes, tilting his head toward the rain, letting it mix with the feeling of defeat curling in his chest. Somehow the storm felt heavier now, and Thomas knew. His future had just slipped through his fingers. The walk home felt longer than usual. Thomas's soaked boots squelched against the pavement with every step, the cold seeping into his bones. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the damage was done, not just to his clothes, but to everything he had worked for. He kept his head down, ignoring the cars speeding past, the people rushing by with their umbrellas. None of them knew what today was supposed to be, what it could have been. By the time he reached the worn-down apartment building where he lived, the reality of the morning hit him like a punch to the gut. It was over. He climbed the narrow staircase, peeling paint on the walls, reminding him of the years spent in this place, the years he had dreamed of leaving. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Silence. His brother was at school, his mother still at work. Thomas let his soaked bag drop to the floor and sat on the edge of the thin mattress he called a bed. The exhaustion from the morning hit him all at once, but it wasn't just his body that felt heavy. It was the weight of disappointment. Then his phone rang. He didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it was. Slowly, he picked up. "Hello?" His voice was barely a whisper. A pause. Then a polite but firm voice on the other end. "Mr. Silver, this is Reynolds Enterprises. We regret to inform you that due to your absence, your interview has been cancelled. Unfortunately, there are no second chances." The words sliced through him. His fingers tightened around the phone. He wanted to explain, to beg, to ask for another opportunity. But there was nothing left to say. "I understand," he muttered, and the line went dead. Thomas stared at the phone in his hands, his mind blank. Years of effort. All those nights studying under streetlights after long shifts. The jobs, the sacrifices, the moments when he thought he wouldn't make it. All of it had led to this moment, and in a matter of minutes it had slipped away. His chest ached. He clenched his jaw, fighting the bitterness rising in his throat. Life had always been unfair. He knew that. But this felt cruel. Then, his fingers brushed against something, a small, damp rectangle in his pocket. He pulled it out, barely remembering when it had been given to him. The business card. For the first time, he looked at the name printed in elegant golden letters, and his heart stopped. Caroline Reynolds, CEO, Reynolds Enterprises. The room seemed to spin. No, that couldn't be right. He stared at the card, his pulse pounding. The woman whose daughter he had saved was the CEO of the very company that had just rejected him. He inhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the card. Could this be a way out? Could this mean hope? His mind raced. He didn't know what this meant, or if calling her would change anything. But after everything, after all he had lost today, he had to try. Hands trembling, he grabbed his phone and dialed the number. It rang once, twice, then, "Hello?" A woman's voice. Steady, but with a hint of something else. Something emotional. Thomas swallowed hard. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his voice rough from the weight of the day. "It's me, Thomas, the young man who saved your daughter today." Silence, a beat, then a deep sigh, and 4 words that made his entire world shift. "Thomas, do you know where I was this morning?" His breath caught in his throat. "No." "I was at Reynolds Enterprises," she said, her voice softer now. "Waiting for you." The room felt suddenly too small. His heart pounded in his ears. She had been there, waiting for him, waiting for an interview that never happened. His mouth went dry. But she cut him off. "Come to my office tomorrow," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We need to talk." And then the call ended. Thomas sat there, the phone still pressed against his ear, the weight of her words sinking in. He had lost his chance today. But maybe, just maybe, fate wasn't done with him yet. Thomas barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed the events of the day. The rain, the girl slipping through his fingers, the cold realization that he had lost everything. And then, like a whisper in the dark, Caroline Reynolds' voice echoed in his head. "Come to my office tomorrow. We need to talk." What did that mean? Was it an opportunity? A second chance, or just a courtesy meeting to thank him for saving her daughter? The uncertainty gnawed at him. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through his window, Thomas was already up, pacing his small apartment. He didn't have another suit. His only one was still damp from the rain, and there was no time to dry it properly. He settled for his best pair of slacks and a crisp white shirt, hoping it would be enough. Before he left, He hesitated by his brother's room. The kid was still asleep, curled under a worn-out blanket. "One day things will be better for you," Thomas promised silently. Then, with a deep breath, he walked out the door. The Reynolds Enterprises building was even more intimidating up close. Towering glass windows stretched into the sky, reflecting the bustling city below. Thomas had spent years walking past it, dreaming of what it would be like to step inside as an employee. Now he was here, but not as he had imagined. As he approached the revolving doors, his pulse quickened. He had nothing to lose, but somehow that made the stakes feel even higher. Inside, the lobby was all polished marble and hushed efficiency. Businessmen in tailored suits walked briskly to their destinations, their polished shoes clicking against the floor. Thomas felt out of place immediately. A sharply dressed receptionist glanced up as he approached. "May I help you?" He cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have a meeting with Caroline Reynolds." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded, tapping something into her computer. Then she picked up the phone. "Mr. Reynolds, he's here." Thomas frowned. "Mr. Reynolds?" That wasn't who he was supposed to meet. Before he could ask, a tall man in a charcoal suit appeared near the elevator. His hair was silver, his posture radiating quiet authority. Even without an introduction, Thomas knew exactly who he was. George Reynolds, founder and chairman of Reynolds Enterprises, the man who had built an empire from nothing. Thomas had read about him before, admired his story. But why was he here? "Thomas Silver," George said, his deep voice unreadable. "Come with me." Thomas's stomach twisted into knots, but he nodded and followed. George Reynolds' office was a world of its own. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline. Dark oak shelves lined the walls, filled with books and awards that whispered of decades of success. Thomas had expected to see Caroline Reynolds here, but she was nowhere in sight. Instead, George gestured for him to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. Thomas obeyed, his heart pounding. The older man studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "My daughter told me what happened yesterday," he said. "How you saved my granddaughter." Thomas nodded, unsure what to say. "I also know," George continued, leaning forward slightly, "that you were supposed to be here yesterday morning, for an interview." A sharp pang of regret stabbed through Thomas's chest. "Yes, sir," he admitted. I didn't make it in time." George's lips pressed into a firm line. "Because you chose to save a child instead." Thomas held his breath. Was that a good thing? A bad thing? Was he being judged for it? Then, to his shock, George Reynolds smiled. "Tell me, Thomas," he said, lacing his fingers together, "do you know what's more valuable to me than intelligence?" Thomas hesitated. "Hard work?" George shook his head. "Character." Thomas's pulse skipped. "Anyone can learn skills. Anyone can be trained to do a job," George said, his gaze sharp. "But character, that's rare, and yesterday you proved you have it." Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. "Sir, are you saying—" George pushed a folder across the desk toward him. Inside was a job offer, but not just any job, a position in Reynolds Enterprises' leadership development program. Thomas's head spun. This program was reserved for the best of the best, young professionals hand-picked for executive training. It was a fast track to success. He stared at the papers, unable to believe what he was seeing. Why me?" he finally asked. George's gaze softened. "Because yesterday, you made a choice," he said simply. "You sacrificed your future for someone else's life. And that tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are." Thomas felt his throat tighten. For years he had believed that success was about never missing an opportunity, never letting anything get in the way. But now he realized something else. Sometimes the right choice isn't the easy one, but it's the one that matters. Hands slightly unsteady, he picked up the pen and signed the contract. As he lifted his gaze, George Reynolds extended a hand. "Welcome to Reynolds Enterprises, Thomas." And just like that, his life changed forever. Thomas could hardly process what had just happened. Less than 24 hours ago, he had believed his future was shattered, that years of sacrifice had led to nothing. Now he was walking out of George Reynolds' office with a signed contract in his hands. But as the adrenaline faded, reality set in. He wasn't given this opportunity just because of what happened yesterday. No. George Reynolds had made it clear. Thomas still had to prove himself. And that test was coming sooner than he expected. After leaving the chairman's office, Thomas was taken to the executive wing of Reynolds Enterprises. He had expected a slow onboarding process, maybe some paperwork, some introductions. He was wrong. Instead, he was led into a sleek, glass-walled conference room where several employees in business attire were seated, deep in conversation. A man in his early 30s, tall, sharp-eyed and exuding confidence, looked up as Thomas entered. "You're the new recruit?" the man asked, raising an eyebrow. Thomas straightened his posture. "Yes, sir. Thomas Silver." The man studied him for a second, then nodded toward an empty chair. "Sit, you're just in time." Thomas sat, trying not to let his nerves show. He had no idea what was happening until the man spoke again. "This," he said, gesturing to the papers spread across the table, "is a real problem we're facing right now, and we need solutions." Thomas's stomach tightened. Was this some kind of test? He scanned the documents in front of him. A struggling subsidiary, declining profits. A strategy was needed. Fast. The executives began debating possible solutions, their words sharp and strategic. Thomas quickly realized he was surrounded by some of the best minds in the company, and now he had to prove he belonged. For the first few minutes, Thomas just listened. He analyzed everything, the problem, the solutions being suggested, the flaws in their arguments. His mind worked fast, piecing things together. Then finally, he saw it. A missing angle, something no one had mentioned yet. And if he was right, it could change everything. Taking a deep breath, he spoke. "What about leveraging local partnerships?" The room went silent. All eyes turned to him. The sharp-eyed executive, who Thomas now recognized as Lucas Hayes, the company's director of strategy, leaned forward. "Explain." Thomas swallowed. He had their attention. Now he had to make it count. He pointed to the financial reports in front of him. "The subsidiary isn't just losing money, it's losing community trust. They're seen as an outsider, which means their competitors have the upper hand. But if we change that perception, if we build partnerships with local businesses, collaborate instead of compete, we could create a new revenue stream, one that's sustainable." A long pause. Then Lucas smirked. "Well," he said, crossing his arms, "looks like the new guy has a brain after all." A ripple of amusement passed through the room. But then George Reynolds himself stepped into the conference room. "Does he?" the chairman asked, his voice calm but firm. The room tensed. Lucas turned to him. "He actually just suggested something interesting." George glanced at Thomas, then back at Lucas. "Is it worth pursuing?" Lucas hesitated. Then he nodded. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Was this real? Had he just impressed them? George looked at Thomas, his expression unreadable. "Then let's see if he can execute it." Thomas blinked. "Wait, what?" "Sir?" he asked cautiously. George sat at the head of the table. "I want you to take the lead on this initiative. Make it happen." Thomas's chest tightened. This was it. His first real test. Fail and he'd prove he wasn't ready. Succeed, and he'd prove he belonged. He met George Reynolds' gaze and nodded. "I won't let you down, sir." Over the next few days, Thomas worked harder than he ever had before. He met with local business owners, analyzed consumer data, and crafted a partnership proposal that could turn things around. The pressure was suffocating. He was new, inexperienced, and every step he took was being watched. Lucas, though skeptical at first, began to notice Thomas's relentless work ethic. One night, as Thomas was going over final adjustments to the proposal, Lucas walked by and dropped a coffee cup on his desk. "Not bad, Silver," he muttered. Thomas smirked. Was that a compliment? Don't get used to it. But Thomas could see it. He was earning their respect. The day of the final proposal review arrived faster than Thomas had expected. He stood in the executive boardroom, facing a group of Reynolds Enterprises' top leaders. At the head of the table, George Reynolds watched him closely. Thomas took a deep breath, and then he presented his plan. Every word, every slide, every analysis, he delivered with confidence. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, George Reynolds smiled. "Well done," he said. "We'll move forward with it." Thomas exhaled, his body flooding with relief. But before he could celebrate, George pushed another folder across the table, a promotion offer. Thomas's eyes widened. This wasn't just an assignment anymore. They wanted him on the strategy team. Permanently. He looked up at George, barely able to believe what was happening. "Why?" he asked, his voice quiet. George Reynolds smiled. "Because you proved something to me, Thomas," he said. "You don't just make the right decisions. You make them under pressure. And that's what leadership is." Thomas felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. For years he had fought for opportunities, for a chance to prove himself. And now, he had. With steady hands, he picked up the pen. And he signed. The transition from an outsider to an insider at Reynolds Enterprises was anything but smooth. Thomas was brilliant, but he wasn't polished. He didn't have an Ivy League degree, didn't speak in corporate jargon, and he sure as hell didn't come from wealth. And some people in the company. They hated that. The whispers started almost immediately. Who is this guy? A charity case? George Reynolds is losing his touch, giving leadership positions to street kids now? Thomas ignored it. He had no time for petty politics. What mattered was proving them wrong. So he worked. Harder than ever. Long nights, early mornings. While others networked at fancy cocktail parties, he was at his desk, learning everything there was to know about the company. And soon people started noticing. Even Lucas Hayes, who had been skeptical at first, had to admit Thomas was the real deal. "You're insane," Lucas muttered one night as they worked late. "Most people would be celebrating after getting a job like this. You're still grinding like your life depends on it." Thomas smirked. "It does." One afternoon, as Thomas wrapped up a meeting, a woman's voice stopped him in the hallway. "Thomas?" He turned and froze. It was her. The woman from the storm, Caroline Reynolds, the woman whose daughter he had saved, the woman who unknowingly had changed his fate. "Miss Reynolds," he greeted, his voice careful. She studied him for a moment, a small smile forming. "I was hoping I'd see you again. I hear my father has taken quite an interest in you." Thomas shrugged. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, ma'am." She tilted her head. "But you don't feel like you belong here, do you?" His stomach tightened. Was it that obvious? Caroline sighed, crossing her arms. "You remind me of him, you know." Thomas frowned. "Who?" She smiled. "My father." Thomas blinked. "George Reynolds?" Caroline nodded. "He built this company from nothing. Just like you, he had no connections, no advantages, just hard work and a willingness to make the right decisions, even when it cost him." Her gaze softened. "You belong here, Thomas," she said. "Don't ever doubt that." Then, with a nod, she walked away. Thomas stood there, her words echoing in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. A few months later, Thomas faced his biggest challenge yet. A major decision had to be made, one that could make or break an entire department. Half the board wanted one strategy, the safe choice. Thomas, however, saw a better way, a bolder way. But if he was wrong, he could lose everything. The boardroom was tense. George Reynolds sat at the head of the table, watching the debate unfold. Lucas leaned in. "Thomas, you don't have to do this. You're still new. If this fails..." Thomas cut him off. "If we play it safe, we'll fail anyway." Silence. Then George Reynolds smiled. "Then do it," he said simply. And just like that, the decision was his. Thomas's strategy worked. Not just worked, it exceeded expectations. Profits soared, the struggling department stabilized, and suddenly, the whispers stopped. Now, instead of doubts, people said, "He's the future of Reynolds Enterprises. The kid is brilliant. Maybe George Reynolds sees something we don't." Thomas had earned his place, and one evening as he stood by the window of his new office, his own office, he took out his phone. He dialed a familiar number. When his mother answered, he smiled. "Mom," he said, his voice steady, "we made it."